When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger, where you'll find over 30,000 mouth-watering choices that excite your inner foodie. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices, plus extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week. You can also save up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with fuel points. More savings and more inspiring flavors make shopping Kroger worth it every time. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
The Athletic.
The Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco.
Gary reports back from the British Grand Prix, McLaren's turnaround explained, and we pay a visit to Aston Martin's new F1 base. Welcome to the latest episode of the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me as always is Gary Anderson, a designer of Grand Prix winning machinery and someone who has lived and breathed F1 tech for half a century. We were together at Silverstone just a few days ago, but the big question I'd like to ask you is whether you've recovered from the shock of seeing a Jordan 195 on a flatbed being driven past us on Friday. That must have taken you back to some tough times 30 odd years ago.
Yeah, I've seen a few Jordans on a few flatbeds in my time, I must admit. But when you look back then, the reliability of cars then and the current cars was just a completely different world. We didn't have all the simulation stuff, so things went wrong. They went wrong on track. So it wasn't a surprise to see it being hoisted on the back of a flatbed and being brought into the paddock. Bit disappointing, I suppose, but as I say, with the reliability of these cars now, normally. It's quite impressive. We are starting to see a few little hiccups because of the engine, the power unit limitations. I think are starting to affect a few people here and there, and I think by the end of the season we might see a bit more of that. Whether it ends up with reliability problems or just penalties prior to the reliability problems, I'm not quite sure, because obviously it's like one of the things that Peugeot did when we were with them with that 195. They had a safety system there whenever anything went wrong, if the oil pressure dropped below a certain level or if the air valve pressure dropped below a certain level, they just shut the engine down. So you would very seldom see a smoky situation. It would normally be just the car was stopped on the side of the track. An electrical problem. And that's sort of the same with really the penalties now, as opposed to seeing, a big pile of blue smoke. I'd rather see the big pile of blue smoke personally, but there you go. That's life.
Well, you normally only see the engine problems generally when the drivers keep going a bit longer than they should do. You think of the Lewis Hamilton one a few years ago, in 2016 it was in Malaysia, or the Sebastian Vettel in Korea blow up, where they just sort of keep their foot in a bit longer than maybe they should do, and you get the fireworks.
But I mean, what I'm saying about that is really in 1995 in Hungary, the next Grand Prix, Rubens was running. I think he was running fourth actually, last lap, last corner. Or the corner before the last penultimate corner, engine just shut down from the fact that the air valve system had been leaking. And as I say, the safety system just shut it down. And that was one time that I sort of had to say to Peugeot, look, we have to, because it would have finished, and we'd have finished fourth. I don't know where we finished, I think it was sixth or seventh or something, by the time he got limped to the finish line. But, we would have finished fourth, I believe, from memory. And, that's the time whenever you've got to, you've got to run the gauntlet sometimes, and that last 200 or 300 yards that you needed to do cost us lots of places in points in the championship. So sometimes you've got to be a bit bold and just switch off all those safety devices, especially in a Grand Prix.
I think just to make that memory even worse, I think Rubens was third on that lap. He was certainly third at the start of the lap.
Okay.
With Berger about 7 or 8 seconds behind him. So I presume Berger swooped past as the failure was manifesting itself. So, yeah.
As I say, as you get older, your memory gets a bit less. But yeah, no, we were right up there, as I say. And that was one of the times whenever, it caught us out, that safety feature. It's fine, practice, all that sort of stuff. But when it comes to the race, sometimes you just have to bite the bullet and say, if you got a problem, you got a problem, and ride the storm if you can. If you can't, well, you might as well fail at the side of the track as fail on the pit lane.
It's one of the many reasons you sometimes hear in the on-car, the radio, the pits-to-car radio, you get them told to hit fail things and that kind of thing and manipulate things, because sometimes they get warnings or sensors or whatever that are telling them there might be problems and there aren't, they have to cancel. So it's a very complicated dance going on in the background with those. But anyway, we've digressed a bit at the start of this podcast. But as usual, We tend to start off with a free hit for you, Gary, in terms of topics. So what's caught your eye this week?
Well, seeing the cars running at Silverstone was quite interesting. We were looking at it from the BRDC centre there, where you see the end of the Wellington Straight breaking into a sort of late apex, long left-hander, and then into the long right-hander. I think it's called Luffield, back onto the old pit straight. And it's quite interesting because you're looking at the cars, and the big thing you can see, I think, is that if anybody makes a mistake, let's say they come in a little bit too quick, you either have a bit of a strange rear end on the car, a bit nervous, and you have to sort of correct the car, and you run a bit wide, or you come in a little bit too quick and you can get the car stopped, but not where you want it to be. So then you get a dose of understeer. So either way, you just sort of miss the apex. You just run wide that little bit, and it seems to be partially from the weight of the car. Once the car has sort of overworked the tires that little bit, be they front or rear tire, the weight of the car the momentum just keeps it going. And sitting there watching it with you, Ed, you could see that the cars that were decent, and this was on Friday morning, and I'm saying, the McLaren's look pretty good, the Red Bulls look pretty good, and from there on down, it was sort of progressively getting to be that the car, the smaller teams as such would miss the apex more often. And it's I didn't really believe it at the time that it would sort of transfer as nicely as it did to the sort of performance for the weekend, but it did. And as I say, the cars that could actually turn in and get the apex, keep the front end, were definitely, as the weekend progresses, end up the top of the pile, which I suppose is what you'd expect. But it's quite strange that it was fairly black and white, I think you might call it.
It's one of those things you often say that you can't make a quick car look slow or whatever, a car can't hide its nature, and I guess we did see, as you say, a little bit of that on the Friday, and I think probably the one thing that slightly benefits is because it was a little bit windy. Some of that was maybe slightly exaggerated, but obviously with your eye you'd have noticed it anyway, but yeah, did very much correlate.
It is true that the wind affects cars, and it always will do because, they are aerodynamic projectiles as such. But the thing is, the wind will affect cars that have got peaky downforce, more than cars that have got reasonably stable downforce. What happens with the wind is you get a plus or a minus because you get a headwind or a side wind or a front wind or whatever, and it affects the car. But if you've got a reasonably stable aerodynamic platform, the wind will just lose your grip and the car will stay underneath you. You might not be able to go quick around the corner, but that's life. Whereas with a peaky downforce car, it'll bring in a one end problem as opposed to a whole car problem. So, a car that's got a little bit of understeer, a car that's got, let's say the front wing end plates are running very critically, or the front wing flaps are running at a very critical level, and the wind affects it more, the problem will be bigger. And I've seen that in the past, especially, whenever we were sort of going through the barge board era and trying to get barge boards to work very hard. I mean, they were very good things. They produced, in my day, they were producing sort of 15% of the overall downforce of the car. They themselves produced nothing. They just changed the airflow to the sides of the floor and created a sealing system down the side of the floor, and brought the vortices down the side of the floor. But when you got a bit of crosswind and the barge boards were working really hard, when you got a bit of crosswind and the barge board fell over, then the whole car just lost a massive amount of downforce. So, as I say, it's about making sure that you don't have too peaky a downforce, because crosswind or tailwind or headwind will affect that type of car even more than a car that's got a nice benign level of downforce. Drivers will still complain because the grip's going away, but then that's what drivers are. They do complain a lot.
There was also quite a good example in terms of the way the McLaren looked on Friday, because it was looking pretty good through Brooklands, but it wasn't going super quick in terms of its outright time, but it always looked very kind of honest and true through that corner, and obviously the quicker corners is a big strength for that car. Don't want to talk too much about the McLaren, but that does show how sometimes regardless of the pace a car's going, you can actually see its qualities. And obviously the Red Bull looked very, very strong as well, just nice and consistent and always doing what the driver wants it to do.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those things you have to accept that all the teams will go through their work schedule to try to get to understand the cars as best they can, and especially if you're putting developments on the car. So you will not necessarily be out there just wringing its neck. You will be driving at a pace where you sort of want to make sure that you can feel the car and and the fuel load would dictate that, the lap time's not really there and the car might be fairly heavy, but at least the team and your driver are trying to understand the car. And I actually was impressed by McLaren's workload this weekend. They did a good job. Overall, they got the best out of the car they could. Very close to pole, which would have been a bit of a strange one. I think we'd all said that, but not quite. But, second, third in the grid, and then in the race, they were there. They were hanging on. They were getting away from the guys that were in fourth, and they were making Max reasonably honest. I still think there was probably a bit more in the Red Bull at that point in time, but they were hanging on there for a while, and impressive with both the drivers as well. Not just one driver, with both the drivers.
Yeah, very much so. Very much the story of the weekend, that one. We'll come back to McLaren a little bit shortly, but actually, I did want to talk about the Red Bull because, as you pointed out, it did seem like just such a compliant car, because everybody talks about the ride height control and that kind of thing. And the beauty of it isn't just that it rigidly holds the car in the place it needs to be. It does that while giving the driver the feedback they need and the feel. It doesn't look like a McLaren of 10 years ago. I remember we watched plenty of times when the McLaren had that phase when they had to have the car really stiff and it was sort of climbing over the chicanes very, very jaggedly. But that seems to be the impressive thing with the Red Bull, that it's able to achieve that control or achieve that ride height, platform control, while actually suspending the car and dealing with the bumps and all that kind of thing. It's doing things that could often be at odds. Yeah, I mean, it's a car that, they've got a lot of anti-dive and anti-lift in the car, and other people have it now as well. So let's say that's the magic bullet by any means, but they've got a lot of anti-lift and anti-dive in the car to try to control the aerodynamic, the forces, and the ride height change during braking. Well, especially during braking, because that's when it works. Longitudinal loads in the car. You're talking braking at 5-6G probably, and you transfer a lot of load onto the tyres. Because the centre of gravity height of these cars is all pretty similar. The wheelbase of these cars is all pretty similar, so they all transfer weight onto those the front wheels when you hit the brake pedal. The thing you don't want to do is transfer aerodynamic load onto the front as well. If you could do, you would love to transfer aerodynamic load onto the rear during braking, because then the two sort of compensate for each other to a certain extent. And there's not that many cars do that. However, I think Red Bull, it's the least weight transfer onto the front wheels, or at least aerodynamic transfer onto the front wheels. But because they've got the anti-dive and anti-lift on the car, they can then run the suspension a bit softer, because the total all, the two of them add up to the total. But the anti-dive and anti-lift on the front and rear suspension, it does nothing when you hit a curb. It's there, it's a freebie. So getting the car softer when you hit curbs with the springs, because you've got the anti-dive and anti-lift on the car to support it under braking, the two go hand in hand. So they can run a softer car, not get the aerodynamic transfer that would normally happen just by allowing the car to sit on its springs, or not getting the feedback that means you need to stiffen the car more and more and more to stop that aerodynamic transfer. So they've gone about it. Obviously it's easy to say because they won a few races this year, but they've gone about it in the correct way. They've got the car supported mechanically through the braking phase, but they're able to clip curbs and get the mechanical grip in the slower corners as well. But I think the thing that's really interesting with this is, as you say, that all makes perfect sense. Anti-dive, anti-lift, all these geometries, they're not new things that Red Bull has invented by any stretch of the imagination. So it just seems really impressive that they've managed to get it all working. This collection of existing ideas. There's nothing particularly magical about them in isolation, but it's that combination of them together, getting it all working. And it's remarkable that it's taken time for others to kind of catch up with this, which I guess shows how difficult it is to actually make all of this work architecturally and control it and actually have the race car perform as you want it to.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. That's why you got clever teams. That's what they set out to do. It's a combination of taking all these bits, it's like bits of a jigsaw, and trying to place one of the bits first. A jigsaw, normally I'd look for the corner bits, do the corners, and then do around the outside and then you sort of build it up from there. But in a racing car, that doesn't always work. You need to start with all of the bits in a big pile and then prioritize them. And obviously, Red Bull have done that very well. The thing is, Red Bull had it last year as well. It was there for everybody to see last year. But I think it was only Alfa Romeo that actually had sort of anti-dive and anti-lift on their car. But it's there for everybody to see. But it's not just a matter of putting on the car and away you go. It's a hell of a lot more complicated than that, because it brings in characteristics to the car that you need to sort of build your way into it, and you need your aerodynamic platform to compensate for it. If you had a car that centre pressure is moving forward under braking, the underfloor centre pressure is moving forward under braking, just by putting anti-dive on it to hold the front up, it won't change that. It'll still do that. So you need the aerodynamic platform to go with it as well. And, it's a whole lot of bits of a jigsaw, and you're trying to place them all more or less at once. You can't afford to start with one, because they all interact and they all need to be, get the same level of priority, to be honest.
Yeah, and we very much see that manifested in the fact that all of that chasing pack swaps around from race to race, doesn't it? So lots of people have got cars that work quite nicely in a certain range of conditions or a certain corner range, etc., whereas Red Bull's got the car for all seasons and is reaping the reward for it. So, yeah, great to be able to watch the cars trackside with you again at Silverstone and, learn a little bit more about them. Well, let's get back onto the big talking point from Silverstone, which is that McLaren revival. It was built on the major upgrade introduced in Austria the previous weekend and augmented by that new nose and front wing that Lando Norris ran at Silverstone. About a tenth of a second, the team reckoned that was worth at Silverstone. I must admit, McLaren almost seemed to me too confident about all these changes before they came in. I remember they were very excited about it in the races leading up to it. And I must admit, I've got fairly used to teams getting very excited about upgrades tend to end up being a little bit disappointed. So are you surprised by how quickly things have turned around for McLaren? It wasn't so long ago in Miami where they were an absolute disaster, and now to be able to be best of the rest, they would have been second and third on merit in that race, but for Piastri losing his podium to the safety car timing.
Yes, I'm impressed, obviously, that they've been able to pull it around so quickly and so well. You can normally see a team taking a few strides to go forward, but not the strides that McLaren have done. They were competitive. Norris was competitive in Austria as well with a part one of the update package. So let's not discount the fact that the car is actually working a lot better. I think their biggest problem was to try to sort of migrate the car performance, the car balance in low speed corners against the car balance in high speed corners. Prior to this update, those two were sort of adrift of each other. You could get the car decent in fast corners, but then it understeered like a pig in low-speed corners, and vice versa. You got rid of the understeer in low-speed corners, and the rear was nervous in high-speed corners. So getting the two to come together. But I think what McLaren have done more than anything else is they have reacted to the situation. Whenever they had a change of structure, and James Key went. I rate James, so I'm not going to by any means criticise him. But it sort of opened the door for people that were working under James to sort of express themselves a little bit. Now, they haven't had any new people joining them from the other teams yet. They have one coming, I think, from Ferrari and one coming from Red Bull. So those two together will either destroy this working operation they have right now or make it stronger. But the guys that were there. So they were always working, but it seemed they were a little bit harnessed for some reason. Not quite sure why that was. But they've been able to express themselves now and go down a different route. And, their operation at the track was good as well. It was the whole thing was very good, So they haven't left many stones unturned since putting this new sort of management structure in place. So yes, I'm surprised they made a step they did, but I'm also not surprised that they weren't going to make a step forward, but they've made a bigger step than I expected. I'd like to see a couple more races, as normal we say. Hungary's a bit different, high downforce. But I don't see any reason why they won't be back up there. And, they benefit a little bit at Silverstone as well, because Aston Martin definitely dropped the ball for some reason. Alpine weren't really at the show. Ferrari fought the battle a bit, but didn't really get there in the end. So maybe they benefited a little bit at that point in time. But I was more impressed by the start of the race because, as I said, they were able to hang on to the back of Max Verstappen, albeit that Max was probably driving with one arm out the window, and singing a Dutch song to himself or something. But even so, they were running very well, getting away from the Ferraris. So credit where credit's due, they've done a good job.
You mentioned the technical changes there, and obviously McLaren have got this interesting system now where they do basically have 3 technical directors. Now, you're right, Rob Marshall, who's technical director engineering and design, he's not there yet. You also got the technical director car concept, David Sanchez, who's not there yet, and then you've got the technical director for aero, who's Peter Prodromou, who's been there for quite some time. But that structure is kind of already operating. Neil Huldy, for example, is in the Rob Marshall role. He's his deputy, but he's effectively in that role at the moment. So it is interesting how that's working together in terms of spreading out the role, and it seems to be all about trying to make people be able to concentrate on what they're good at rather than getting sort of bogged down in the day-to-day minutiae of the sort of more bureaucratic and processy stuff in the factory and just actually doing the job. So it does seem like a very, very early, gently encouraging sign about the change that's been put in. And I should note, Andrea Stella was very much at pains after the race, that's the new team principal, to say that it's not actually about the personnel, as in James Key going and others coming, but just that shift in the way the structure and the system worked has actually already had a benefit in terms of just accelerating their progress and making them see where they needed to change direction. So do you think there's enough from this one step to say, actually, this is a team that does appear to be on the right track now?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the big thing for me, I suppose, is that whenever you look at some of the other teams, they're not accepting where they are. They're not genuinely sort of saying, right, we should be better than this. And obviously, I'm going to name 2 top teams in Mercedes and in Ferrari. They both bring developments, but the thing that I think McLaren did was to sort of reshuffle themselves to try to make sure that everybody was realising the problem. And I found this in my time as well. When you're technical director for a team and you're going to the races and the whole thing's there, you sort of find grey areas. If we had done that, it might have, we might have been better, or we should have done that and it would have been better, and vice, all that sort of stuff. So it is quite important that you separate those 2 bits and try to make sure that your race team report back with the problems, and the drivers as well as part of the race team. They come back and they make sure that the team of people that are responsible for, coming up with solutions to problems, come up with solutions to real problems. And I think that's what McLaren have got to. In the years gone past, I've been to McLaren and sat with them during the time whenever I was giving them a bit of rubbish in my media stuff, as I do. Not meaning to by any means to rubbish McLaren, because they're a team that I actually think is fantastic, because I worked there back in the old days. But what I could see from outside was they weren't seeing outside of the forest. They were inside there in among the trees and didn't look out. Now you need to get outside sometimes and look in. And once you do that, you can see a whole lot of different things. And I think that's one thing that McLaren have done. I think, again, the same deal would be, I saw Toto Wolff getting a quick interview after the race at Silverstone. And, he was saying, their problem's straight line speed. It's not. It isn't straight line speed. It's a whole combination of stuff that adds to straight line speed. So, you need to accept there's a problem, find that problem and really focus on it. And I think McLaren, that front-running bunch, are the team that have done that best. And I think their progress is relative to acceptance of a problem and going off and identifying how to fix it and fixing it. And they've done a great job.
Yeah, I think your point there is very valid, because I remember at the start of the season when they had the launch, they were very downbeat at their launch, and it was a little bit concerning. You're thinking, well, this is pretty negative stuff from this team, and they were still making noises about, as the season progresses, we want to get up to be in a position where we're 4th fastest or whatever, and I was thinking, well, that's pretty optimistic. But I think that does probably reflect some very clear injection of reality, I guess, that they had there. And it is interesting because I think teams are so big now, they're so enormous. As you say, that whole thing of sometimes you need to look in from the outside. And I think that's probably something that holds true for anything as a general principle. But for the size the teams are now, the inability to see kind of the bigger picture, because everybody's got their own little area. It's like if you look at one little piece of data, I don't know, you look at a car's lap times or whatever, and you say, well, this car's race pace wasn't very good on those tyres. But you don't look at the race scenario, like was there a slower car that was just difficult to pass, parts in front of whatever, all these other things, and then you multiply that by the countless other factors. So that seems to me to be the big challenge of F1 teams now, how you get that kind of vision while there is so much going on. Because if you're at ground level, it's so complicated, there's so much going on. How can you possibly begin to grasp it?
Well, if you take a typical example, how many times have we heard about the driver couldn't get the tyres up to working correctly in the first lap? And yet Silverstone was an example because of the weather coming qualifying. Cars were sitting down at the end of the pit lane for 10 minutes, on their tyres they were going out to do a lap time on. So, in reality, that's all rubbish. It just means that, you have to buy into the problem, and it's very easy to blame something. It's very easy to say, the tyres weren't right. Tyres didn't work right. The front tyres weren't up to temperature, blah, blah, blah. But when push comes to shove, at a race meeting where getting on the track was more important than being perfect, the cars went and sat down the end of the pit lane. And not one of those car tyre temperatures would have been above 20 or 30 degrees whenever they left the pit lane, because it wasn't the hottest day in the world either. And, it had rain about, a little bit of mist here and there. So, that's an example of looking at it and actually not trying to find an excuse, just looking at the real picture. And as I say, it's very important, even with the car itself. You've got to do that. You've got to really look at where you really are and the circumstances behind it. Because, if you have to follow somebody, this is why people wanted to qualify in pole position for hundreds of years, on anything you're doing. If you're out front, you got less risk than you have if you're in the middle of the pack. You've got less turbulence from other cars. Your car can work as it works, so you can come to terms with your car much, much quicker. So it's in traffic, in the middle of a race, if you're running 9th or 10th or 8th or wherever, and you got 3 cars in front of you, your car isn't the car you're driving. It's the car that's left with that airflow that's coming off those 3 cars in front of you. And you have to be able to see through that a little bit, and see where you should be if you were out front in clean air.
And we should say, obviously, this puts McLaren into that chasing group. I think it is going to fluctuate an enormous amount in the coming race. I think Hungary probably will play a bit more to the weaknesses of the car. So we'll probably see Aston Martin rising, as you alluded to, and McLaren maybe struggling a bit more. So, but there's just that group of cars that's going to get shuffled around from race to race. It is pretty remarkable how extreme that group is now. It was pretty attention-grabbing, even if it was just Aston Martin, Ferrari and Mercedes. But now you've got McLaren kind of inching its way in there, and every once in a while Alpine threatens to latch onto it before falling back away again. So it shows that behind that Red Bull, it's actually been an utterly fascinating season. If Red Bull Racing didn't exist, we'd probably be calling this an all-time classic championship battle. So that tells you how the regulations aren't necessarily the only thing that dictates it.
No, that's for sure. And I think you're sort of slightly wrong there in it being Red Bull. I think, we got to ask the big question sometime very soon. Max Verstappen against Sergio Perez on the same car. That is the car. Now, if that was another team, if that was, Mercedes or Ferrari or, McLaren, and the drivers were so far apart so often, you'd have to sort of think, hang on a minute or two, what's going on here? But at the minute, because they sort of get away with it. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Sergio, but for some reason he's not at home with the car. There is something in the way you have to drive it, but Max just seems to be on it. Now, whenever we look at any track you go to, it doesn't matter which track, within the first 3 laps of practice on a Friday morning, Max is normally the fastest of the lot, of anybody, normally. And that shows the confidence the guy has in what he's got under him, because you have to have it. To do that in the beginning of a practice session on a Friday morning when the track's still a bit dirty and you haven't been around the track and, you're learning about the new curbs that have been fitted and all that sort of stuff, still Max goes bish, bash, bosh and does it. And Sergio seems to have a battle. If he starts bad, on a weekend on a Friday, he never really recovers. If he starts decent, then he sort of can maintain it normally. But there's a big difference there somewhere along the line. So I think anything behind Red Bull, and Max Verstappen, you've got to say that's a very, very competitive season. And we've seen Williams, that's fantastic to see them and Alex Albon getting up into that top 10, You could say now on a regular basis, to beat 2 Ferraris at Silverstone, no matter how it happened, it doesn't really matter. The CV will still say I had 2 Ferraris behind me. So that's fine. But yeah, I'd like to see it, be more competitive. It's a lot closer from front to back because the regulations have defined that it's a lot closer. The regulations are, so complete, I suppose you might call it, for what the car can be, that it's a small detail. So it's closed the grid up, but the front team and the back team are still the front team and the back team.
Yeah, that will always be the way, but it's certainly made for an interesting British Grand Prix weekend, and I'm sure it will be very fascinating when we get to Hungary shortly.
You're listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Aramco continuously push the limits of engineering excellence. As the global energy partner of F1, they drive a shared vision to real-world innovation that aims to lower emissions, enhance performance and accelerate human potential. Aramco, powered by HAL.
One of the things Gary and I had the chance to do during the British Grand Prix weekend was to take a look at the new Aston Martin F1 base that's now occupied by the team. I'd had the chance to visit a few times before it was complete, so it was my first time seeing it in fully realised form, while for Gary it was a first look round. So here's our chat from Thursday evening in the Aston Martin factory.
Well, you may hear a little bit of music in the background because we are at the new Aston Martin factory. It's Thursday night at the British Grand Prix and they're having a big media event to show everyone around. Obviously, I got to go around the factory a few months ago when it wasn't quite complete. I was here for the launch as well. But you don't really want to hear from me because Gary is the perfect man. Now, Gary, obviously, you built pretty much the first factory for this team, if you can call an industrial unit at Silverstone, and you were heavily involved in the one that's just been replaced. So what's your first impression having had a wander around this new state-of-the-art facility?
Well, I think you'd say it's different. They've done a fantastic job here. To be honest, it is interesting because the architect Guy Austin is the same guy that did the ex-Jordan factory. So it carries something over, I suppose you might call it. But the way this is laid out, I'm impressed. I've just been up for a wander around the drawing office there, and it's just massive. There's something like 500 seats up there, so it incorporates everybody, all the race engineers, the wind tunnel, the aerodynamists, all the design engineers. It incorporates everybody, but it is absolutely huge besides what I was used to. And as you say, going back to the start of Jordan, we were in a lockup across on the track, one of the actual Silverstone buildings, and when I arrived there was no office, there was nothing. I ended up building it with somebody else just to get some partition walls up, and then finding 3 drawn boards and so on. And then, interestingly, Andy Stevenson, the team manager, was just showing, or racing director, or whatever he's called now, was just showing me a roll of Jordan 191 drawings that they've got up there. I've got a roll in the loft of my garage. And at some point in time, we're going to get together and hopefully invite yourself and a cameraman up here to the factory, because they're going to put them on a wall somewhere and actually just let's roll out 30 years ago and see what it was like. It'd be interesting. I'd love to see it. The ones they've got are all manufacturing drawings. The ones I've got are all schemes. So there'd be a nice compromise between the actual thing and the schemes that we did. So it'd be an interesting day, I think.
Yeah, that'll be quite something. And to give people an idea of where we are, we're by the race bay, so that's where the cars are prepared. The great thing about this factory is the design office you just referenced, that's upstairs, really, really big. And I know everyone working here has been desperate to move into those as they did recently, because the old factory was rather outgrown it by quite some margin. But there's also, in terms of the way this is laid out, everything's meant to be logical and coherent. There's the big long street, the street as it's called, with everything off it. So what did you make of just the general layout and the coherence of everything? Because there's a lot made about the fact this is a smart factory and it's optimised for modern F1.
Yeah, I think it's laid out very well. I think it's very important that you get some continuity through the factory, and this street does that because, as you say, each side of it there is something. It's all labelled on the doors what's inside of there. So you can walk down that street and you can see every department, you can see everybody, they can see you. So communication with this type of layout is a lot easier than if somebody's hidden in a corner somewhere, in a porta cabin out the back. It's actually really open. So that's an important thing for me. The race bays, it's probably the smallest part of the actual operation. There's 4 little bays here, plus another bay they have for setting bits and pieces up and sorting them out. But there's room for 4 cars in here that you can take to bits or put together or whatever. And then you've got all the sub-assembly shops. But they're all connected up somehow. So it is very important because communication between all the people in the company, which is now, I think it's around 800 people, everybody counts. And the more you can get that communication to work, the better the product will be. So, I think they've done a good job.
One of the things that does strike me, and this was something they talked about actually when we came round when it was being built, is for a race bay, it's actually quite light and airy, and there is natural light coming through. That was something they were very, very keen on. I've been to a lot of the race bays in F1 factories, and they're quite often pretty much sealed in, and it's all artificial light. So actually, this feels like quite a sort of spacious, airy factory by F1 standards. They're obviously taken into account the human element as well as the practicalities.
Yeah, I think they focused on that. Again, the drawing office, the view out of the main window right down one side of the factory is amazing. We had a good view out of the drawing office in the old factory as well. But this being 10 times the length makes it a bit different. But it is very open, even though you're in a confined space as such, like the race bays are, because obviously you don't need much more than the size of a car and a metre around it to work on the car, build the cars up, and all your benches and tools. But even within that area, it's very open, and it's a lot of it's glass. So everywhere has glass. You can see in. I mean, I remember way back when Brabham moved their factory from what was Newhall to Chesington, and I left whenever I was at Newhall, and I rejoined them again at Chesington. And the biggest difference they did was build every wall up so it was like 7 foot tall. It was doors, so you couldn't see anybody, and it was the most disappointing thing I've ever seen in my life, because communication, it didn't breed communication at all. To get something done, you had to go and look for somebody and find them. Whereas with this, with all the glass, all the windows, all the open areas, you can find people. So it's, very good. I have to say I'm actually really impressed.
Yeah, all of the leadership at Aston Martin has made a big thing about the communication side. I know Technical Director Dan Fallows has talked about it. Mike Crack, the team principal, was just talking about it. But it's also a great example here of just how much F1 teams have grown in terms of the fact we've got all these separate departments, quite a few of them even I can look into and I know what's going on in them, but it's almost a baffling array. All the functions of a Grand Prix team, I guess a lot of them were there in the past, but they're all kind of thrown together. But now you've got all these separate areas for fabrication and obviously non-destructive testing, as you were just talking about. So there's so much broken down now that you can see every almost small phase of the car just by looking through a few doorways and windows.
Yeah, I mean, going back through the years of Jordan into, the name changes on the way to Aston Martin, the big emphasis was, because the factory was quite small, was to get manufacturers outside to supply stuff to you. But then you still had to do your inspection, and you still had to do, I like to call it destructive testing, not non-destructive testing, because, there's nothing like breaking something.
Is that just you with a big mallet hitting things?
It's more or less, yeah. Jumping on a front wing or whatever. But you have to do non-destructive testing, because all the componentry that goes on in the car, the wishbone assemblies, the wing mounts, everything, they'll be tested to a level, and you'll measure deflection. But that level's still quite a long way away from the ultimate force that the thing will withstand. So that's how you do it, and then every component that's built will be tested to the same parameters, so you know that it's actually in line with what you expect from it. You don't go to the destructive part, other than maybe right at the beginning of its life, to see where what the safety factor is on a certain component. So you have to have all these areas, and as I say, with the old factory, where everything was manufactured outside, so you really had to keep a good, strong eye on it coming in from an outside supplier. Here, because everything's inside, any problems that pop up, you can relate to it immediately and actually identify it and fix it. So it's actually easier having all these people and really pursuing everything in-house, because you can control it a lot better. And that's where they'll benefit from. It's just having the control over the componentry that makes the car up. So, yeah, it's all a good shift.
And that having control is a big thing for Aston Martin. Obviously, there's a lot less they're doing that they're outsourcing. It's not always the most cost-effective way to do it, and often not the best way to get the very highest quality. But also, there's the whole question about expansion of their facilities, doing the hydraulic system down the line themselves. The gearbox they're almost certainly going to have to do themselves with Honda, depending on what the regulations are. So they're already thinking about what gearbox dynos and that kind of thing they need. Obviously, a lot of the equipment in here was in the old factory, but there's a lot of new stuff as well. So when you've had a look around, does this give you a big extra boost of confidence that this team is going to go places? Obviously, the results this year have already done a big part of that, but are you sold on Aston Martin racing in F1?
I don't think you can never be sold on anybody, and I think Mercedes are a bit of an example of that this year and last year, and even Ferrari over the last few years. You can never sort of confidently say that any team knows what makes it work. But they're in a position now where they've got the momentum going, and I have to say I was quite impressed by speaking to the race team guys that I know very well. They've sort of done a very good job at keeping themselves detached from the fact of this expansion, just focusing on what they're there to do, which is run the cars at a race meeting and do the best job they can, and try to keep their head down and not get too excited about new white walls. And that's important because you can lose yourself very quickly. You can get too excited about everything and expect it to be different. It isn't different. Come Sunday, there'll be a car sitting in the front of the grid that'll be fastest, and there'll be a car sitting at the back of the grid that'll be slowest. That hasn't changed because you've got a bigger factory. It'll still be there. So you've got to go to a race meeting, and you've got to do the best job you can with the piece of equipment you have. And Aston Martin this year started strongly. They've, over the last 3 or 4 races, they have sort of petered out a little bit. I'm not sure why that is, but I think everybody was expecting them at Monaco to potentially bring home a win. And then it kept on, that momentum, or that thought kept on going over the next couple of races. Now, we're just at Silverstone. It's a really fantastic track. It requires, a driver can contribute, a chassis can contribute. So this is a track where the car will stand out a little bit depending upon who you are. And it's the first one of these for quite a few races. So this is probably a good measure, and hopefully the weather will allow it to sort of unfold, because after this weekend, I think you'll have a very good measure on where everybody stands.
We've just seen Technical Director Dan Fallows wandering past, having a bit of a look around, enjoying his new surroundings. Obviously, the team only moved in a few weeks ago, really, so almost they're still settling in and getting used to where everything is and how everything works. I'm sure there's quite a long snagging list, various things that they've had to fix. But how long do you think it would take to get 100% used to working in a place like this compared to the old place? Is it the kind of thing that you move in, as you say, you're focused on your job, and after 5 minutes of admiring the white walls, you get on with it? Or will it take a little bit of time to be 100% comfortable and not have to kind of think, oh, where do I need to go? Well, how does this work?
Well, I don't think they actually sort of used like a light switch to move in. The upstairs area moved in first. That's all the drawing office area, the design area, all the offices. So they all got working first, and then they moved in downstairs. So I think they've done it the right way. It will be different, but at the end of the day, they've sort of set them up in little groups. So communication in the drawing office is within its own group. So if you have a suspension area, then you have them all together so they can talk to each other easily. And they've got little coffee shops and stuff so that you can all meet up for a cup of coffee and a bit of a chat. So I think they've really tried to keep that communication line as open as possible as you get bigger. And I don't think the factory itself will really hurt the communication. It's about the expansion. The expansion so quickly could hurt it. But in reality, they haven't expanded as quickly as I thought. They have placed a few people in there. They've given them time to get their feet under their desk. And then, they've expected something from them. So I think it seems to me like it's a pretty open place to operate. And that's a bit contrary to what I actually thought from the outside. So the people, as I say, the people that were working here in Jordan days, I've spoken to, they're quite enthusiastic for it all, and they're all willing to make it work, because there's a motivation driving through the factory, and that could bring them, success in the near future.
Well, it certainly seems to be going that way. We'll let you now, Gary, have a bit more of a rummage around and see what it is you like and don't like about the factory, because there's always some things you notice that aren't quite up to scratch. So we'll leave you to do a little bit of tidying up and a bit more admiring the new walls.
Well, if you're listening to this podcast, you must recognise the value of asking questions. At Aramco, answering questions helps them engineer a better future. So if you'd like to know how something works in F1, it'd be great if you sent us a question. And if you're lucky, we might answer it on a future episode. You can either write us a question and email it to podcasts@therace.com or record a voice note, remembering to include your name, that we can play on the show. And our question this week is from JG Propone, who says, with the current comments from Hamilton regarding starting work on next year's car, I was wondering what is the advantage in working on the 2024 car instead of continuing improving the current car. Since there are no changes for rules for next year, continuous improvement seems like the way to go, unless, like Mercedes, you want a major change in your rear suspension or chassis. So Red Bull could keep developing the current car and still be ahead for next year.
Yeah, JG, I think you've sort of asked the question and answered it yourself. If you've got a fundamental problem that means you need to build a new chassis or new transmission housing because of the rear suspension, or you want to go from a push rod to a pull rod front end, or you really want to attack the anti-dive or anti-lift characteristics, then fine. The best way of saving some money out of your budget cap money is to not build a new chassis for next year, just because it's next year. A chassis itself now is probably, £200,000, that sort of area of expenditure, at least 150. But it takes a lot of design time. It takes a lot of, if you're going to change it, you've got to have really, really good reasons for changing it. Now, as for Red Bull, I don't see any major reason for doing that. So yes, I agree with you. Just continue developing the 2023 car, spending that chassis money that you would have spent on building a new chassis, wisely. You might still build, a couple of new chassis for the drivers, but you wouldn't change the geometry of it, so you wouldn't have to do all the new tooling and all the research time that goes into that. So you will be better off financially, and you can develop a few more front wings or a few more underfloors as the season goes by. Whereas, Lewis Hamilton said something strange, I think, after the race. I think in one of his interviews, he said, I know what's wrong and I need to tell the team. It seemed a very strange statement from a driver, because obviously we all know what's wrong. The stopwatch doesn't lie. There's something fundamentally with the car. And, whereas James Allison was saying a couple of weeks ago, it's not all in the underfloor, there's lots of other stuff that goes on, and it's not Lewis's driving position and so on and so forth. So there seems to be a little bit of loggerheads between the technical department at Mercedes, the driving department at Mercedes, and Toto might have a couple of fires to put out there fairly soon to just keep it all flowing along in the right direction. I know Lewis knows what's wrong with the car because he drives it, and he must explain to the engineers what he feels in the car. But I don't think he should take on the job of being technical director yet. I don't think he's got that experience. So I do agree with you that the 24 will be should be more or less an invisible year. The teams that haven't got a theoretical Red Bull aerodynamic philosophy may have to join that club. But it's not just a magic bullet either. There's a hell of a lot more to it. We'll still see, you could have all the cars looking like Red Bulls and there'll still be one at the front and one at the back. Who'd it be? Who knows? But there'll still be one at the front and one at the back.
I think it's quite an interesting question with Mercedes about the direction they need to go in, because it can be quite easy for a team to see they're struggling, and they'll partly understand why, in that they'll understand the limitations of their car. And it's very easy to look at another car and then say, I want to do that. There's stories of non-technical team bosses, should we say, saying, right, they've done that, they're good, so you're going to do that, go in that direction. I imagine you were had that sort of pressure on you at times, but you always wanted to know why you were doing things. So do you think there's a danger Mercedes are getting a tiny bit lost with things? Because it's very easy to say, right, that's the direction we go in, and then you have a little moment where things go well and it doesn't go so well and you lose confidence in it and you can start going off in another direction. So I imagine there's that crisis of confidence as well, in that they must be sitting there thinking, well, we know we need to do something. We know some of the answer to the question. We know a certain percentage of it. They probably know most of it, but those crucial little few percent of knowledge they're missing. So it can be really difficult, because it's dead easy to hair off in a direction, but very, very difficult to choose the right one.
Yeah, it is. I mean, as I've said many times, there's no team out there, and this includes Red Bull, that know 100% what makes the car fast. the team that's winning at a given point in time with a given set of regulations seems to know most of what makes that car work for those regulations. And it's not so much the aerodynamic geometry of the car, I suppose, the surface detail or the geometry, as I say, of the surfaces. It's more the aerodynamic philosophy of the team and the leadership of the aerodynamic philosophy, what you're trying to achieve. And that's a similar thing to say is, what level of acceptance does your group put on centre pressure shift during braking? Is it 0.5% acceptable, 1%, 2%? Do you really care? The same with steering lock. For every degree of steering lock between high-speed corners with 2 or 3 degrees of steering lock to low-speed corner with 9 degrees of steering lock, what do you want the centre of pressure to do? What is that objective? That's the philosophy of the car. And also, you arrive at a corner, you hit the brake pedal. Let's say you arrive, 340 kilometres to end up straight. You hit the brake pedal, you got a 250 kilometre corner, still a very fast corner, so aerodynamics are dominating. And, you got all that transient condition from the end of the straight when you've tried everything you can to make the car as efficient as possible down the straight to get the maximum speed out of it, including the DRS being open. So you shut the DRS in, that sort of speed change. You're talking about 80 metres braking, not very far. So within 80 metres of hitting the brake pedal, you're going to turn the steering wheel, and you want the car to give you confidence that you can turn it, that it will turn and not just go straight on, that it will turn and not just keep rotating and the rear end give up. And then through that roll, the transient steering, and coming back from the attitude change that you had under braking, you want the centre of pressure, the balance to stay the same. So the driver can really, exploit the speed through the corner. And we've had many, many drivers through time. Jenson Button was typical of carrying good corner speed. And when Lewis Hamilton was driving with Jenson at McLaren, Lewis was one of the late breakers. So you've got different drivers in the same car trying to achieve the same thing. So you're trying to adapt your philosophy, aerodynamic philosophy, to suit the driving style of one or two drivers. And that's really why Max Verstappen is doing what he's doing, because he has bought into the fact that Adrian Newey's aerodynamic philosophy and his driving philosophy are teaming up, and they get the best out of it. Both of them get the best out of it. So it's not, as I say, just the body geometry. It's more the philosophy of how you want, because in all these cars, the centre of pressure shift will move around. It'll do things, and it's just about trying to get that to work for what you want it to do at given times during the cornering phase.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, really, that we're already well advanced on 2024 cars for those teams. Obviously, they've been running stuff in the wind tunnel for some time already. It starts earlier and earlier, and almost the real battle that will be manifested on track next year is being fought already. So lots of work going on behind the scenes, but certainly you'd be very happy to be in Red Bull's position. So thanks very much for that question. And for anyone who has a question to ask, remember the address to send it to is podcasts@therace.com. That's podcasts@the-race.com. And as I always say, no question is too simple, because there are always hidden depths, and Gary is up for tackling questions no matter how complex or seemingly straightforward. So thanks, Gary, for your wise words on this episode. We're going to be back between the Hungarian and Belgian Grand Prix for our next episode, so join us then for more from Gary.
You've been listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Be sure to like, follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode.
The Athletic.